All right. So we're gonna go over a couple things today. We're gonna catch up on some of the latest news. What's the hot what's the hot stuff going on in the world? Obviously we're gonna start with Iran. So so the latest and greatest is that the that Iran still refuses to sign basically come to an agreement, which is they keep going back and forth. They refuse to concede on the two biggest issues that the U.S. keeps putting out as far as a deal that needs to go through, which is enrichment and the making the Strait of Hormuz completely open. And unfortunately, Iran thinks that they not only can they um, flex sort of, they want more power than they had prior. So international waters is 13 miles off the coast of a country. So the Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. So they have majority of it, but they don't control all of it. And what they now want is to control more than they had prior to the war, which doesn't make any sense because all right, give me 1 second. I think we just may have had a bit of a technical error. Let me just double check something. No, we're still good. Okay. Anyways, so this doesn't obviously make any logical sense from the standpoint of the Iranians, but the Iranians never really, the IRGC and the Islamic Republic are not really well known for their logical decisions, and especially since we have eliminated majority of theolo- the theocratic leadership in the government, and what's left over of the IRGC commanders have not really been known for making some really good logical decisions. And so they tend to, all right, um, continue to go down this route of, just their country is in the process of, because of the blockades and the constriction of their economic pipelines, resources, their economy is on the process of failing. The people within the country are getting more and more. Already, we're not a fan of the current regime, and are only it's only getting worse for them. So the fact that they keep doubling down on this, even though they don't really have the resources to do it, and so one of the questions I know that a lot of people ask is why don't we just blockade the whole thing? If they have such limited resources, if they have just these fast attack boats, why don't we just completely just block everything off? And that's a really good question. The answer to that is that it would take so much resources to fully block off the entire coast of Iran that essentially touches the Strait of Hormuz, that entire section of coast of Iran. And also, it would set our boats into doing static targets. And it's also kind of hard because then they would have to be kind of playing border patrol for every single boat. And that's one, the Navy's not really equipped for that. And it would just take so much resources. And then you put the Navy at risk of being static targets. So that's one of the reasons why we're not doing that. This is we're still able to constrict what's going on. We're able to blockade essentially their blockade, and we're able to do it within a way we're able to keep our ships and our personnel as safe as possible. So, and then also one of the big updates is that the UAE decided to start doing strikes against Iran. And I believe they're one of the, outside of Israel, they are the first Gulf nation to start striking Iranian targets inside of Iran since the beginning of this conflict. All right. Joshua George. America and Iran will be in war until August 9th. Iran has nukes. Um, well, so one, is it possible that we could still be in this conflict till August 9th? It is. I I personally doubt it. I think that there will be some sort of ceasefire or some sort of concession, especially the Iran, because I don't think that their economy and the IRGC can last till August 9th in its current predicament. But, you know, it's possible, but I highly doubt it. If I was to make an assessment, I don't think that they will last that long in the current conditions. So, but we're going to watch a few things here. All right. Hold on one second. Let me double check we're on the right thing. All right.
Before we go any deeper, Iran's oil storage clock, an Iranian oil ministry official told the New York Times this week that it's about 40 days from running out completely, with some well closures potentially permanent after that time. And then at the same time, it looks like as of today, as of this morning, ceasefire talks have just collapsed. Trump called Iran's counter proposal totally unacceptable after Tehran demanded war reparations. Yeah.
So this goes back into what I was saying earlier, that then granted, these are sources that, at certain levels. So everything should be taken with a grain of salt. But this is already sort of kind of confirms of the analysis that we already have, is that they're running out. They're being constricted because of the blockade that we then created, because during the initial part of the conflict, before we initiated our blockade, they were still getting out, I think it was like 1.5 billion barrels a day, which was helping to keep their economy afloat. But now that we've constricted that, that's no longer the case. So, and we knew that eventually they were going to run out. Obviously, they're trying to smuggle in other sort of resources over the land-based borders, but it's at no level able to keep up with the demand that's needed within the country. So the fact that there is this report or the assessment that they will be running out almost completely within 40 days kind of tracks with what our current understanding of the situation is going on right now. Let me actually move one thing real quick, if you guys mind. So just want to move one window here. All right. All right. So, yes, Iran has nukes in Iran-Iraq border. They will nuke Saudi Arabia. Yeah. Well, that's what we're in the process of. I don't believe that Iran actually has nukes. I think that they were still trying to get in the process of getting the enrichment of the uranium to a certain point where they could get it to weapons grade. But I don't think that they were ever able to. And the fact that we have destroyed their ballistic missile programs, even if they were to able to create a nuclear weapon at this point, the delivery system would have to be something that was like put together, because there's a different ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. You can either put together something like design a sort of payload for that particular ballistic missile, or you can then design a ballistic missile for that payload. So, all right, let's continue watching.
We're going to send you a check for all those different naval assets that were just destroyed. Yeah, I'm sure that's going to happen, Iran. But again, they're trying to.
This goes back to the ridiculousness of what the IRGC and their demands. It just each one goes back and forth. They are not making any sort of sense. They want, when you're losing a war, you don't get to have things that you didn't have prior. Like, for example, they had their coastal waters, 13 miles off their coast, but now they want to control the entire Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, which they didn't have control of that. So when you're losing a war and you're going to negotiations, you don't get to demand things that you didn't even have prior. that you could only demand if you were winning that war, and they're obviously not winning that conflict. So the logical sense within these negotiations, especially from the Iranian side, just isn't really there, which begs to believe like there's probably one of two things going on. Either one, the current people who are making these decisions to make these demands are either one, not very intelligent, or two, they're trying to delay and hoping for some other scenario where maybe like China comes to rescue or something else to happen, that they're trying to delay this whole process. It could be either or. I don't really see how them delaying this process helps them. If anything, I actually think this delaying this process only helps us and only further weakens them and any sort of resolve, and also any sort of negotiation tactics or strength, because as time goes on, they're going to lose more and more leverage.
Grift us, and they also want full sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. So what does that mean? They're basically saying, we want to break international law because you're only allowed to have 13 miles off your coast. Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. So Iran's like, look, we just want to break international law and be gangsters and be the mafia of the Strait of Hormuz, and you need to just accept that. That's what they're telling the entire world, and they're surprised that no one's accepting that deal. They also want sanctions relief, they want assets unfrozen, and all of that is likely tied to what's said to be 440 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that the UN nuclear agency confirms Iran is likely sitting on right now. So that's a short technical step away from...
Yeah, so that, going back to, it's a good point that basically this is international law as far as the international waters goes. Off of every coast, it's 13 miles. So, and then also they want reparations. So this just adds the number of list of just ridiculous things that they're asking for when they want to ask for reparations done to them, but yet they were the ones striking not only us, but the Gulf Oman states, the Persian, or the GCC. And, if anything, the reparations, because usually, look at the Treaty of Versailles or any treaty where a country is lost, it's the country that loses that usually pays the reparations, not the one that's winning. So, if anything, that a part of the deal should be that Iran should have to pay reparations, not just but to all the countries that they essentially shot missiles at and did damage to. So, and we've talked about this before. We're talking about specifically uranium. And I knew that there's a certain level of uranium that is needed for power, for running nuclear power plants. And then there's a higher level of uranium needed to build nuclear weapons. And I've talked about this prior, but I decided to educate myself last night on the whole process of uranium. So here's what I have learned. That typically uranium-235 is, once it's at 20% or below, it's considered low enrichment uranium. And then once it goes past 20%, it gets high. It turns into high enrichment uranium, or that's what it's now designated. Nuclear power plants need between 3 to 5%. Weapons grade uranium is considered at 90%. So that seems like a long way. Like, okay, if they're only at 20%, how do you get to 90%? Well, the interesting part about that is 90% of the effort as far as enrichment required is done just to get to the 20%. To get from 20% to 90% actually requires a whole lot less work and time. And so majority of the time takes it to get to the 20%. So if they're already at the 20%, there is a danger. It's closer than you think it is. But then if you go off the numbers of just like, oh, they're only at 20%, logic would make you think like, oh, we still have like 3 times the distance to go. We have another 70% to go, but that's not exactly how it works, because apparently getting to the 20% is 90% of that battle. And then the last 70% is the other 10%. So I found that interesting. So that kind of goes into some of the more arguments where people are like, we can't, you have to be, once they get to like the levels of, once they start crossing into high levels of enriched uranium, that is only a matter of time. So based off of the, and actually I've got a document here. Let's actually pull this up.
Weapons.
This is actually where this is from. Let's throw this in here. One second. No, sorry. I moved the wrong one. In a moment. Okay. So this is from the Centers for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. So it talks about the uranium and what's needed for, all right, so yeah, it's HEU. So highly enriched uranium is anything that's above 20%. And uranium considered to be enriched 29% is considered weapons grade. So, and then this is the part. When a research reactor uses 23rd, actually, let me find it. So, is that, yeah, so here it is. 90% of the effort needed to produce weapons grade fissile material is about getting to the 20%. So that, what I found was very educational, and it kind of helped me to understand some of the arguments basically for and against whether or not we should allow them to have enrichment just to have for nuclear power and stuff like that. Okay. All right, let's go on. So another thing, interesting thing, and we'll go into this. So let's see if this plays. I think this was having issues loading. So another thing that they came out with, and then let's see if this is the. May not be it. So one of the things that came out was there was another essential post claiming that Mojtaba Khomeini, which is the son of Ali Khomeini, the previous Ayatollah, who was killed in the first day of the strikes, and then Mojtaba, his son, who is the sort of successor into for that particular supreme leader. We knew that he was injured, but we have not seen him, which is odd because if he's alive, that the Iranian people, and just in history, would one of the first things they would do is they would make sure to show him. They would show his voice, or they would show you get on TV like, look, hey, here I am still alive. The fact that we have not is really interesting, to say the least. So they came across this video. So this was a couple weeks ago, and this is in I forget what the name of this town is, but this is a town inside Iran. And this is a video where they revealed, so this is essentially, they created this memorial in this town of, I guess this is in the town of Mashhad. So this is on April 25th. So this is about 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. A little over 2 weeks ago. So this is a memorial of everybody notable that has been killed through this entire operation. And you'll notice, obviously, Ali Khomeini is in the center. But as we zoom in, you're going to notice something. All right, so at the very top left, you have, that's Ayatollah Khomeini, who's the original IRGC leader. In the bottom right, you have Qasem Soleimani, and in the top right, you have Mojtaba Khamenei, his son. So if he's still alive, as though the Iranian government claims that he is, then why are they putting him up on memorials already? So once again, going back to the inconsistency going on within the messaging coming out of Iran. You know, if you know the history of the Iranian people, and any time that there's something that they want to, like, there's ever been a military action against them, they put their leader at the forefront on the camera. And so the fact that they have not done that, and then there's like this video releasing, he still could be alive, and it's just messaging that maybe the people in Mashhad didn't know that he's still alive and just assuming. That's entirely possible. But the fact that we haven't seen him, and there are people within Iran making memorials for him, if I had to guess, I don't think he's still with us, if you will. Okay. So going back into, let's go
this counter proposal, which failed to meet the key U.S. demand to end its nuclear program. Mark Boyle checking all the latest at the live desk. Good morning to you, Mark. Iran knows the terms. They know what the president's asked for. He's given them more than enough time to make a deal. So what's next in all of this?
Well, it appears as if the president's moving towards the option of maybe militarily going after Iran, Jan, once again. Right now, Iran's counter-peace proposal came up empty-handed, short. And the president says,
so this is, going back to the what we talked about earlier, is that the Iran keeps going back and forth on this. They're claiming that they want to have talks, and then the two things that we will not negotiate on is the complete and opening of the Strait of Hormuz with no stipulations, like they get to tax it, or they get the controls of their waters, which is 13 miles off of their coast. Everything past that goes back to international law, and then also the completely dismantlement of their enrichment program. And these are the two things that they essentially, the two things that we want are the two things that they continue to refuse to essentially go after.
This Project Freedom is a military operation that's paused that he might restart once again. This would allow the U.S. Navy to help guide cargo ships through the Strait of Hormuz. When the mission was ongoing, we knew the U.S. Navy did take on several attacks from the Iranian military, including missiles and drones, just to name a few. The president also telling reporters recently he's considering stepping up military strikes again there in Iran after receiving the briefings from CENTCOM forces in the Middle East.
It was just unacceptable. A lot of...
So going back to what we were talking about earlier, is that, what if we've decimated the Iranian forces? Why don't we just blockade the entire coast, which I talked about earlier. You can't really do that. You could, but it would be extremely resource intensive, and there would actually be a risk to our Navy, because we'd be essentially providing static targets, and they'd always know where they are. And this creates a number of risks militarily. And then also, for what end? Because you would then have to turn the Navy into sort of like a blockade of entire country, of like a coast guard almost, which is they're not really trained for. And the fact that they're already using like civilian type boats anyways, it would just be, the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze, in my personal opinion, which is one of the reasons why we're not doing it. You have to think about whenever you make a decision, what is the risk and what is the gain out of it, right? Because trying to blockade their entire coastline it's a lot of risk and a lot of resource intensive for very little gain. What we're doing is, by just applying the blockade, it's low risk for a much higher potential reward. And obviously, the thing is it takes time. The other option here, in which they're talking about, is start escorting ships, which in its way, it's going to be slightly more, it is going to be resource intensive, but it allows these ships to stay mobile, which, keeps them safer. and will make the Iranians have to come to us, which is definitely a viable option, better than trying to blockade the entire Iranian coast.
A lot of people said, well, does he have a plan? Yeah, of course they do have the best plan ever. I mean, Iran has been defeated militarily, totally. They have a little left. They probably built up during this period of time. We'll knock that out in about a day.
Meantime, the State Department is offering a reward for information on the inner workings of the IRGC's financial dealings. The administration offering $15 million for details on how Iran's military group is financially backed and paid for, who's helping them dodge U.S. sanctions. Finally, this morning, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and other top defense officials set to be on Capitol Hill in about an hour to an hour and a half. We'll track that.
All right, so this is not surprising, but also interesting you have to think about when we are trying to constrain Iran's economy. We obviously have sanctions, but we're also, through the blockade, we're cutting off their source of oil. At least how they are essentially were paying for things, which was, I believe, was 1.5 billion barrels a day that they were still getting out through China before we instituted our blockade. And so obviously to accelerate the process of, making them concede to our demands, we need their economy to essentially fall quicker. And one of the things is we know they are getting help through other means. And that reward that he's talking about, which I think was, they said 15 million, is by essentially putting them out there, we can possibly get in information that can help us to stop the other ways that they are still bringing in money that's slowing the process of their economy falling. But I will say this, when it comes to offering rewards for intelligence, it is a method. It is not the greatest method, because what ends up happening is people are going to give you a lot of intelligence tips. Most of them are going to be are not going to be worth anything, because they're trying to see if they can get the money. And so we're going to be flooded with intelligence tips because of this. It is possible so we then have to do the work of assessing and validating these tips to see if anything are worth following. But it is possible that occasionally we do get solid intel out of this process, but it's not guaranteed, and it's definitely hard work. Okay. So Callan and Compliant, good to see you, brother. Rack Shadow, what's up, man? China is helping Iran with drones and oil, and they're also like that one ship, which was I believe it was called the Tuska, the one we intercepted. That was the Iranian, I believe, flagged merchant ship that was coming from a Chinese port. It was like one of the first ships that was stopped and raided by the Marines, had chemical compounds on it that can be used to make ballistic missiles. So we know that they're trying to help them, and we're stopping them as much as we can. So definitely stopping their oil transit of the 1.5 billion barrels a day to China has definitely helped. But we know that while they can't bring in as much oil over land as quickly, we know that they are still getting help over land, and we're trying to, through intelligence and other types of operations, try to constrict that as well, because the more we constrict, the quicker the economy falls, and then the quicker that Iran will have to concede to our essentially deal points. If not, it will get so bad that they are then have to worry about the worst case scenario, which is the Iranian people essentially rising up and taking their country back, or some sort of revolution. Will it be that clean? Probably not. But just because you're going to have opposition groups who everybody's going to try to vie for power, that's just the way the world works. It's the way people work. But hopefully, if that does come to happen, that the greater population of Iranian people that want a democratically elected process will will prevail. But it's one thing at a time, right? So right now, the Islamic Republic is in charge, and they are the next obstacle, and that's what needs to be taken care of. So that's why they're doing all this process, trying to constrict their economic and other aid that's going on through Iran through other sources. The more they can do that, the quicker this process goes. So, and going back to that video that we showed, there's an assess that they have about 40 days worth of oil, right? Does that include with what's already being aided, what's being smuggled into the country? I don't know. It's possible that is included. It might be possible that it's not included. So you have to think about it in both scenarios. You have to think that, like with anything, like and you have to remember, a lot of people, when these intelligence people, is intelligence analysts, when they make an assessment, whether they know it or not, there's always some little bit of bias within it, right? You have to take that into account with taking anybody's reported intelligence assessments. And so probably it's going to be more than 40 days, but that is an indication that they probably have a couple months left. I would probably say the more accurate number is probably closer to 60 days, but we will see. All right. Calendar compliant. I saw today where Pakistan and Afghanistan were allowed to shelter aircraft when the strikes were happening. Can't believe we trust Pakistan to mediate talks. So let me kind of expand on that relationship. We don't trust Pakistan to mediate these talks. They were the only people that Iran felt was not so biased against them that that they would use them as the talks. Like, we don't trust them, right? But we also didn't want to go all the way to China to do talks. So Pakistan is sort of like a necessary evil in this particular situation. We have never really trusted Pakistan. If you know anything about their culture, their government, and sort of like the political groups that operate and are either gaining or losing power within Pakistan, sometimes they're bigger fans of us, sometimes they're not. And Pakistan kind of, they're like any other country. They're trying to play both sides. They see that continuing this war is actually bad for them as well, like it is for most countries. But Pakistan and Afghanistan sheltering aircraft from Iran, one, probably should not really come to anybody's surprise, just because of if you honestly look at the history of the dealings of the United States with Pakistan, we don't trust them for a reason, right? We did go into, they were essentially helping to shelter Osama bin Laden. And there's been a number of things over the years. There are assets and people within the government who are kind of more pro-Western. It's like typically in the history, it's the I believe it's the Pakistan Intelligence Service. If I remember correctly, it's called the ISI, which I have worked with in the past. And a lot of them are Western educated and have been supportive of us in the past. But that, like most things, like in most political movements within countries, those change. Iran will be taken over by Turkey. Already has a treaty with India with peace talks next. I can tell you that Iran is not going to be taken over Turkey, because I don't believe Turkey has the ability to take over anybody. If you look over, you have to understand, for a country to invade, right? The Islamic Republic as a regime might fall, but that does not mean the people of Iran would ever accept Turkey, right? One, they don't have the military capability to take over Iran. Second of all, the Iranian people would definitely have something to say. That the Turkey taking over Iran, that's not going to happen. I'll tell you that right now. Iran has a treaty with India. They will peace talks next. Well, so it's all about hosting peace talks because the peace talks are not with Pakistan. They're not with India. They're the ones like they're hosting, and you can say that they're mediating, but they're not really mediating because it's really between us. The only mediation is really they're holding the talks. That's it. Right? They don't have any sway over anything. Like they're like if India was more powerful than we were, then that would be a different story. Or Pakistan, right? When we do talks, when the United States mediates, we actually do mediation because we are the most powerful country in that room. So, but when you're not mediating the United States. You're just hosting peace talks. There's a difference. Okay. Let's move on to. So another aspect to this is Brennan Brown AJC man. He says a dictatorial regime can endure extreme situations longer than a democracy because people living in fear are forbidden from having an opinion. This is actually true. This is a good comment. Because of a lot of different reasons of how the governments are set up with regimes, like, the government will essentially keep all the resources and let essentially their population starve. We've seen this time and time again in communist countries that were in the process of failing, other failed states. The people who are in charge, even though the country's failing, they're going to keep whatever little power, resources, and money that they have. So they can definitely last longer because of that. But at the same time, that does have the ability to accelerate the process of a people wanting to revolt. That also, I'll caveat that with, because these people, the Iranian people, have been subjugated for the last 47 years, and it's been that long. When you've been subjugated for going on like generations, it definitely makes the people very, more probably they're scared. And for them to rise up, because if they were to try to take over the government, people are going to die, right? And that's scary, right? You have to put yourself in their shoes. And that makes it much, much harder for them to do this, right? And the process of trying to bleed out the Islamic Republic through political and economic means, and then hoping maybe that the people of Iran will rise up, and us not putting boots on the ground, it makes this process longer, it makes it harder, and it's going to make it bloodier because thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Iranians might have to die for the revolution to take down the for the people of Iran to take down the Islamic Republic. It's going to unfortunately require a lot of people to put their lives down. The only other alternate scenario to this is if the Islamic Republic was to just overall surrender and give control of the country to its people. And I don't think anybody outside of Iran or even inside of Iran believes that will ever happen, because these guys know that it's not only this is their livelihood, but their lives are on the line for this. All right. So the next part of this, right, is how does this affect us? How does Iran, what's going on in Iran is affecting us, right? So luckily we get, first of all, we're going to talk quickly about, let's go to, all right. So we're going to talk about oil. So the interesting thing is that, all right. All right. So how does the Strait of Hormuz is affected, right? So luckily for the United States, we are not really all that affected by directly about the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, because of we actually get very little of our oil there, but the oil markets are still the world markets for oil are still affected, right? Which is one of the reasons why the prices have still went up, even though we're not all that dependent upon the oil. So, so you have to remember, roughly 20% of all global oil consumption goes through the strait. And one of the positive things that has happened, which has been a bit of a boon to us, is that a lot of that traffic has then shifted to the Gulf of America, which has benefited a lot of oil companies within the United States. It's definitely helped the economies of Texas and Louisiana, where a lot of our oil is pumped in that area. So I'll tell you that Yemen wanting to close the Mandeb Strait, a proxy of Iran, if they've been wanting to do that a long time, they kind of lack the resources to even do it effectively. And every single time they do, that they even try to do something, we hit them, and they kind of stop for a little bit. But also you have to remember that typically they are funded because they are a proxy of the Islamic Republic and the RGC. And because of what's going on in the RGC, their funding to the Houthis in Yemen has been also restricted. So they are actually also, all the proxies, because of this war, are actually hurting. And we have seen a drastic drop in operations by the Iranian proxies because of the lack of direction and funding coming out of Iran because of this conflict. So, all right. Now, let's see here. All right. So one of the things that Trump has proposed is a tax. He wants to cut off the federal gas tax. And he has proposed suspending the federal gasoline tax temporarily. And then once this conflict has sort of been resolved, we're able to kind of get the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf completely open. That they would slowly phase back in the gasoline tax, because, obviously with any action, there's a reaction, and that definitely goes in the economy. So a lot of the things that are paid for by the gas tax is like road repairs, highways. So a lot of the infrastructure that gets repaired and also new roads that get built gets paid through this gas tax. So if we suspend that, right, and it may reduce the price of gas temporarily, but it's also going to make other things suffer, probably put a lot of road either repairs or the creations of new roads, probably put that a bit of on hold. So the question is it worth it? So based off the data that I was able to look at, and let me see if I can find this real quick. All right, let me find the... So if you look through the different articles about this, they basically say the government charges 18.4 cents per gallon and 24 cents per gallon on diesel. So if it's currently at a price of $4.52 a gallon, it's going to reduce it to $4.34. And the question is that enough? Is that really going to make us that big of a difference for us? And for what? To gain or to lose some of the processes or the things that gas tax funds, Is it going to completely halt all repairs on highways throughout the country? I don't know for sure, but it's definitely going to restrict them. And I honestly, and this is just me, I don't really notice when the gas jumps up like 18 cents. I'm kind of like, oh, it was like $2. Now it's $3, $4, kind of those bigger jumps. And so for me, that's just me from a psychological perspective of like what kind of triggers me or what I even notice. So I actually don't know if this is the greatest idea. Because I think this is more of a move that makes a great headline, but in practice, does this actually make sense? And that's what a lot of these things that we need to do. And you have to understand when it comes to politics, a lot of times they will do things just because they sound great as a headline, but are they actually doing what they're supposed to be doing or what they claim? And also, is the juice worth the squeeze? And that's the other part of that. So, yeah, so that's definitely something to think about. Do you guys think that this tax, or essentially this the suspension of the gas tax, to my understanding, the different articles that I've read, will reduce it by 18.5 cents? Do you think that's worth it to what the possible what things may essentially might be cut off for the reduction of services that are funded by this particular tax? Do you think it's worth it, or should we just kind of like suck it up and just keep going through? Because also something you can think about, most conflicts, like look at the history of conflicts that we've been going through as the United States, is most of them last years. The Iraq War was over 10 years, Afghanistan, well over 10 years, Vietnam, close to a decade. Most conflicts are probably at least a year, if not more. We're at 2.5 months. I believe this, if I remember correctly, started February 28th. And when we look at perspective, and you have to, a lot of times sometimes you have to step back and you have to look at things in perspective. This has not taken that long, right? And now if we fast forward 6 months to a year from now, and this conflict took 4 months to do. That will, in hindsight, compared to other things, that's actually a very quick and impressive time to get in, destroy their military capabilities, get all their things, and then get them to capitulate to your terms. That's a big W. But when you're in the middle of it and you're incurring these sort of effects, like we have higher gas prices, people are afraid that World War III is going to start. There's a lot of anxiety that goes on with this current situation. And you're like, okay, it's been going on, and you're in the middle of it. You have to remember keep in perspective that this is a very short time. And it does, especially when your goal is to topple a regime by not going through boots on the ground, which is arguably the quickest way to do it. And if you're going to do it by restricting the economic means, that takes longer. So if that is the plan, like, what do you want? Do you want us to have boots on the ground? Which I personally don't want us to have boots on the ground. Or do you want them to try to accomplish this task through economic means and pressure, sanctions, everything like that, and then hoping the Iranian people will rise up and possibly take over, or the Islamic Republic stays in power and then they give up so much concessions that they're not a problem for a while? You have to understand that's going to take more time. So, and also I get it that there are other people who don't think we should be involved in this at all. I get that. I personally think that what the Islamic Republic and the IRGC not only represent, not just to the Iranian people and what they've done to the Iranian people, is also their proxies and their terrorist networks, what they do to throughout the world. They are definitely a threat. I do think that they should be reduced in scope and power, if not eventually overall eliminated, but we need to do that with me personally without doing boots on the ground. So I think this is the best way to do that, but I also understand that this takes more time. So we should keep that in perspective when we're wondering like, oh my God, why is this not over? We're 2 months. Well, you look at the history of conflicts. If this is even over in 4 months, that's huge. That's big. Okay. Let's see. U.S. controlling Venezuela and Iran, I think will have major economic impact on China, is also in Russia. Absolutely. So Brennan, also a very good point once again. So a lot of what we're doing, right? There's second and third order effects, and is this a part of a greater strategy? And probably the answer is yes. So prior to Venezuela, and probably, yeah, we'll start with basically prior to Venezuela. China definitely had a level of influence in the area because they were had major influence in some of the largest oil reserves and areas of natural resources between Iran and Venezuela. But by taking out Maduro and then essentially taking that out and then cutting China out of that, and then now we have reduced China's access to Iran's oil within the Persian Gulf and the access to the Strait of Hormuz, we have significantly, just for these two actions and these two conflicts, if you will, reduced China's influence and control of oil throughout the world, which is, if you understand what China's goals and their strategies and how they conduct themselves, because they want to become the world superpower, but they want to do it through economic means and political means and not really militarily. We are sort of fighting them at their own game, and these two conflicts have definitely done a significant blow to their influence. So it is a part of the U.S. strategy, which is to reduce China's influence. These two conflicts have definitely done that. How China sort of adapts to that particular situation, we will see, because China is not dumb, obviously. So it will be interesting to see as this conflict continues, and let's just say that it goes the way that we want it to. What is China going to do? How are they going to adapt to the certain new current situation of the world now that they have less influence in South America? They now have less influence within the Iran, or just at least a whole lot less control over the oil coming out of both of those countries. All right. Let's see. You need revenue through national consumption tax. Everyone expects overnight results after the Maduro raid. Absolutely, Callan and compliant. But you also have to understand that's a different situation, right? And I'm sure that you guys do, but for everybody else, the beauty of a dictator who really kind of, what is his main motivation? Just being in power and having money. And when you have a culture and society where religion is not involved, it is a much easier process. But when you're dealing with when it's not just one man, when it's actually an entire government, and that's bound together by not only theology but ideology, it makes it much harder, because instead of removing one man, you have to remove arguably over 1 million people, right? Like, there are different metrics of how you can sort of quantify how many people would need to be taken out in order to remove this regime, but it's obviously much larger than one person, right? So, like, the IRGC itself is 160,000 people. You have the civilian governments, the MOIS, the Besiege, which is rumored to be over 600,000 people, and various portions of the normal Iranian military that are loyal to the IRGC. So you're probably at least 1 million people, if not more, that would need to be removed for this regime to fall, which is obviously much larger than one person. And then also their motivations are much harder to convince otherwise, just because it's based off of not just money and power, it's based off of theology and ideology, which is much harder to root out, as we've seen through history and this particular situations, right? But Trump is dumb. Not factoring Hormuz close was an epic blunder, proving his incompetence. So Rack Shadow. So we've been planning doing stuff like this for a while, for decades. I was actually a part of some of the planning process going back to as early as 2012. And I can tell you that we knew that they would try to close the Strait of Hormuz, right? But there are so many things that we can do without, but also putting ourselves at risk, putting ourselves in a sort of situation that we don't want to get ourselves into. So, and we can conduct military operations and hope for them to do something, and then we then have to react of how they're going to do this, right? Sort of trying to plan a conflict. And I heard this comment the other day, and actually when I was at an event and I was talking to General Michael Flynn, and he said, this war is not going the way that Trump wanted to. And I very respectfully responded to him, what war has ever went to plan? None of them have ever. You know, there's that famous quote from Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Fights, wars, conflicts, they never go to plan, right? But the question about who wins them is, do you sort of plan for these contingencies, and then are you able to adjust and adapt to the overall changing environment of that battlefield, that economic environment? And whoever can do that the best is usually the ones who win. Like, take the United States in World War II, right? We were militarily a inferior war machine compared to the German armada, but we used our manufacturing power, and we won through basically overwhelming them by numbers, right? So we were able to adapt to a situation. We knew we weren't going to be able to develop tanks and airplanes that were better than theirs, but we were able to throw more people and more machinery and more weapons at them than they could handle. And essentially that's why we won World War II. So, so I wouldn't necessarily call him dumb just because that the Iranians tried to close the Strait of Hormuz. We knew that they were going to do that, but the question is, do we have the ability to just stop them outright? Technically you do, but it actually puts us in a very risky position. So he is trying to do this without, one, putting boots on the ground, and then two, without stringing the entire Navy across the Iranian coast and setting up staggered targets, which would put our navies at risk. So you have to take a lot of these things into consideration. So I would not be so quick to call him dumb. I don't think that he is. I think that he does have some interesting vocabulary, and it has a very hyperbolic vernacular that sometimes rubs people the wrong way. But in also certain cases, it actually does work to its advantage because of his negotiating style and the way he does things. So you do have to try to look at it like there is pros and cons to everything. And, there are certain things work better in certain situations and vice versa. So, all right. Let's see. Okay. All right. So let's move on to. Actually, you know what? Let's talk about that. Give me 1 second. Let's look up let's see if the we talk about UAE leaving OPEC. Let's talk about that. All right. Could leaving UAE actually help the U.S. more and supply lower prices? Because there's a number of different factors that come into, and honestly, I wish I had queued up a video for this in particular. So, you can see that there are a different, just by searching this, right? Because that's the important thing. Anytime we're looking at a situation, we want to try to find both views, like people who support it and people who are against it. So, so I've heard this particular argument. So let's go into this about this particular by Honor Alizad. So he's talking about the fact that there are a few important lessons here as far as UAE leaving OPEC. Right, it leads to a diversification, which needs to happen because some people believe that there was a bit of OPEC was essentially controlling. If you're looking at this from an American perspective, the UAE actually leaving OPEC is actually a good thing. It creates more flexibility within the overall oil industry throughout the world. And because anytime that there's ever been a monopoly, right? Because this could be looked at as sort of a monopoly within that particular area as far as the oil goes. And there's a reason why whenever we've encountered a monopoly within the U.S. economy, right, one of the first things that they want to do is they want to strike it down, because whenever there's a monopoly, they are able to dictate prices, and there are a lot of negative effects. But we'll think of it like this, right? So one of the beautiful, obviously capitalism is not perfect, but one of the benefits of capitalism is competition. And whenever there's competition, you have all these companies who are trying to essentially be the best in that particular industry. And how do you do that, right? By creating the best product at the lowest price. So as companies are going back and forth and fighting over this process of like creating the next best thing, but then how do I make it cheaper, is how the consumer, we benefit from this process. When you have a monopoly on an industry, that never happens. And then that's when like prices always stay up, they never compete, and the products actually usually don't get any better because there's no reason for them have to improve a product or make it cheaper. So when you take that monopoly away and the kind of like the tenets of capitalism come in at that point, the consumers win. And also the products get better, they get cheaper, everybody wins. So by the UAE leaving OPEC, you sort of take a OPEC sort of monopoly as far as like oil within the area takes a bit of a hit, which is actually, honestly, it's a good thing. So, but let's see what he said. Things. Let's look at that. Okay, so what is the history of OPEC? So OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was founded in September 1960 in Baghdad, Iraq, by Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela to coordinate petroleum policies, secure stable prices, and counter the dominance of the multinational Seven Sisters oil companies, headquartered in Vienna since 1965. So
OPEC is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. It was
Let's get
formed in
educational
1960 by 5 oil exporting countries and has grown to include 9 more nations. The reason? 1960 was a time of a globalizing oil market. Demand was growing, but oil-producing countries weren't the ones benefiting. Global production and price was controlled by 7 Western oil companies. That's where OPEC came in. Its goal was to give power back to the nations who had the oil the world desperately wanted. Their plan was to regulate supply and to manipulate prices. In other words, become a cartel. Member countries meet every 2 years to set production quotas. The lower the quotas, the higher the price for oil-consuming countries. In its early days, OPEC did not have a lot of influence on prices. But in 1973, OPEC introduced an oil embargo. The crude price quadrupled. Some countries were forced to ration gasoline. At the time, OPEC accounted for about half of global oil supply. OPEC lost some influence in the 1980s. High oil prices meant people were switching to alternative fuel, non-OPEC production increased, and a global recession saw demand for oil decrease. By 1986, the price crashed. Over the next 3 decades, the price of oil continued to fluctuate for a number of different reasons, despite OPEC's attempt to control it. OPEC.
So you'll notice the giant drop here in 2008. So you went all the way up to $140 a barrel. And then you'll hear, if anybody watches the show Landman, they always talk about that they want the price to sit, I think it's like between it's like 80 and 100, which is like their fucking sweet spot, right? Because if it goes, I think I'm gonna fuck this up. If it, yeah, it's just you can see, but this is many things, not just the overall housing industry. Because if you guys remember the housing crisis of 2008, it looks like a number of different things in the economy were drastically affected, which, obviously was led to by the overall housing crisis, which kind of killed the economy. But a lot of the economy, as you can see, got crushed in a lot of different ways, including oil.
influence has dwindled.
That's right, 75, 80. Yeah, so it's like, I know it's like if they don't want it to get like definitely a red line for it is like 100.
It now represents less than a third of the market share. Add to that the increase of non-OPEC nations to the oil market, like Canada and the US. Recently, OPEC said it would restrain output to boost prices. That would be the first production cut since 2008. But there are doubts that OPEC could even accomplish that.
All right. So there's a little history of OPEC. So yeah, they were not started by the United States. If anything, they were actually created to compete against, what is they called, the 7 sister companies, which essentially were all Western oil companies, it looked like. And yeah, so that's interesting. I didn't realize that they were at one point, I knew that they controlled like half the world's oil supply, but I didn't realize that they had lost that they dropped to basically about a third. So that's something I didn't actually know. But because of all the stuff that's going on, OPEC's majority of what OPEC's strength is what's going on is affected by the Strait of Hormuz, right? And so, but you also remember, like a lot of these countries outside of Iran, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, all these other countries are, who are the OPEC's members again? Let's go back. So Baghdad, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, yeah. And Venezuela, and obviously UAE joined later. But that it's interesting because of when Iran retaliated, if you can see that they pretty much struck almost everybody else who's on this list. So not only are they kind of screwing everything up for themselves, they're screwing things up for the other for these other countries, for the other Gulf country states, and they are not getting any love, and the fact that the UAE is now actually doing offensive strikes into Iran is definitely telling of how the overall region feels about the situation and how they feel about Iran. So nobody here, I can tell you, outside of Iran and China, want the current Islamic Republic to stay in power. So. Interesting. So, let's see. Yeah, it says founded in 1960 as a response to the Western oil companies unilaterally reducing the posted price. So it's kind of interesting because OPEC was sort of created because these the other seven nations that they talk about had sort of a monopoly, and so obviously OPEC was created to sort of break up that monopoly, which makes sense, right? Monopolies never help anybody. I'll tell you that right now. Like when you're unless you are the in charge of that particular, or you're a CEO of one of those companies that's a part of the monopoly, that's the only time. But majority of the world does not benefit from monopolies. So they should always be broken up, or they're always competitors, right? And there's so many different parallels to this, right? And actually, something that also you can always think about is when governments are in control of industries and when it's not privatized. Let's take space. How little was space, because space until Elon Musk and SpaceX, space travel could only be done by governments because it was so expensive that they're the only ones who could afford it. But what happens as soon as you let a private company come in, right? What does capitalism lead to? Is they want to make a product, they make it as efficient as they can, and they make it as cheap as they can. And that's exactly, and now they've revolutionized the space industry, and now we can set up rockets all the time. Why? Because essentially a capitalist company, a private company, came in and made an industry better. So you don't want monopolies, and you don't want governments controlling industrial or certain, pretty much any industry, because especially for somebody who worked in the government for most of his career, I can tell you the government should never be in charge of anything. They just screw it up. So, all right. So next we're going to go into, we're going to talk about some Mexican cartels. All right. So give me a second while I move this over. All right. All right. So we are going to do. All right. I think I just fucked that up. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Mexican cartel. So just bear with me for a second. All right. Sorry. This whole streaming thing is the computer is deciding to go a little on the slow side. That's awkward. All right. So basically, the U.S. has been expanding its pressures on the Mexican cartels, and there's always been an issue with essentially how we deal with the cartels. And one of the different things is through the national security frame. Do we designate them as a criminal organization or terrorist style organizations? or even sort of a hybrid threat category. So there's a lot of pros and cons to this. So we're going to watch because what's going on is just what just recently happened. So we're going to watch this quick video about the about, I think it's like 9 Mexican governors were just indicted over alleged cartel ties.
Prosecutors have Welcome back to Fox and Friends. New York prosecutors have unsealed indictments, including accusing the Sinaloa governor Ruben Rocha Moya and 9 other current and former Mexican officials of allegedly working with the Sinaloa cartel to protect fentanyl trafficking operations. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, says her government will review the case, but she has pushed back against what she calls foreign interference. Here now is Mexican Senator Lily Tellez.
So let me make sure I don't get any copyright stuff by keeping their thing plugged up. Let me move over. All right, so let's move over to interesting stuff while we talk about that. All right, so 9 what was it? 9 governors or 9 provincial leaders have been indicted because of they are protecting the Sinaloa cartel, right? And so, oh, you know what? What was it? It was the and you have the interesting part about that, right? Is we want to sort of extradition. I believe that's what they said. Extradition. Actually, let's listen to it one more time.
Welcome back to Fox and Friends. New York prosecutors have unsealed indictments, including accusing the Sinaloa governor Ruben Rocha Moya and 9 other current and former Mexican officials of allegedly working with the Sinaloa cartel to protect fentanyl trafficking operations. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum.
Okay, so it is the governor of the Sinaloa district or area. I apologize now. I'm not as familiar with the geography of Mexico, but they are. The interesting thing about this is what you have to understand about the president of Mexico and the history of that particular president. So I just want to pull up a couple of things before I apologize. Okay. Just get rid of that. All right. So the current president of Mexico is known as, her name is Claudia Sheinbaum. All right. So one of if anybody's familiar with exactly how she came to power, she, oops, I'm clicking on the wrong things. There was a lot of controversy coming over. So she was elected in 2024, and then the controversy is they wanted essentially a new president, or essentially a new administration that was different from the previous one. And then she was sort of kind of in a way, sort of handed sort of like given the reins from the previous administration. And there was a lot of assassinations through all the presidential candidates. And the last number that I saw prior to her getting elected, it was 37 other candidates during the presidential election timeframe that were assassinated, right? And this isn't anything really new. It just hit high levels. It was like the highest level, because in previous elections, there's a lot of political violence and there's a lot of assassinations. Just since that she's been in president, I looked this up earlier, 21 of her cabinet officials have been assassinated just since she took office, right? And that's not to mention the 37 that were assassinated who were just trying to become president. I don't know if they were all in election for president, but they were all 37 candidates during that election. So I don't know if all 37 of them were. But during that time, that's what was going on. And she has been criticized because she is believed to be like this official and all these 9 other officials protecting the Sinaloa cartel. And obviously there's multiple different cartels within Mexico, and this president and other officials in the government are essentially not taking care of the problem. And there's a number of different reasons for this. There's like money that's being aided to these officials. Some of them are just afraid because of how often they get assassinated. If you're a government official in Mexico, you get, there's a lot. So for example, if you were to put up like here, for example, here is a list. Actually, I'm going to just port this over. Everybody can see this. All right. So this is a list of the politicians killed during the current president of Mexico's tenure, right? And there are 21 total that have died. And as you can see from this list, and I guess I get it. I understand it's Wikipedia, but I did verify this through multiple different sources. So you have a number of different members. You get top of the list, the general secretary, shot 3 days after taking office. Well, that wasn't very long. Abducted, stabbed, shot, intercepted by gunmen, abducted, shot, killed, shot, ambushed on the highway near the municipal estate. 2 police officers also killed, shot dead and running around traffic. So you can already see that being a politician in Mexico is not exactly the most stable job for your health. So so maybe not necessarily all the politicians in Mexico are corrupt, right? They are threatening them because if you do anything against the cartels, they will kill you, right? So as the Mexican government, that creates a whole level of problems. Like, how do you fight them? How do you get politicians to be elected and to fight the cartels, knowing very well you'll probably get killed, your families will probably get killed? So it's definitely a deterrent. So how do you combat that? And as from the United States, we have to do essentially something about it. And so one of the things is talking about how we deal with them, right? So when you make something a terrorist organization, it changes who actually deals with it versus who is a criminal organization. And let me pull up oh, actually, I do want to bring this up real quick. This was back in 2024. This is from Reuters. All right, so this is about the Mexican candidate assassination hits grim record. So right before the actual election went off, it was the number of assassinated candidates hit 37 ahead of Sunday's vote. So that's just an example. All right, now let's get more into the different advantages and sort of disadvantages as far as the cartels go. All right. So because the debate centers on whether cartels should be treated as criminal organizations, terrorist styles, or hybrid threat category. Okay. So it's a Western
Mexico for the most part. We have a down. And they come through Mexico for the most part. We have a problem because the cartels rule Mexico and nobody else. The cartels, they just rule it. And, we lose 200,000 people a year through this poison that pours into our country. So we have the sea done, meaning the ocean, waterways, pretty much done, 97%, and we're going to have the land done very soon. Down. And
So this is interesting because you have to think about right, what are as Americans, what are our biggest issues? And we have seen over the number of years, especially through Biden's administration, the side effects of what comes out from, especially the negative side effects and sort of, what's what I'm looking for? Aftermath of what happens when you have an open border, which is you have a lot of, because of the system, we have a lot of crime coming in, and it just created a sort of a highway for what we already had, which is a very large drug problem, and just created, it only got bigger. So obviously we need to close the border, but even if you close the border, the cartels and the criminals are still going to try to find a way in, around, under it, over it, however they do it. And so you do have to sort of try to solve the problem at its root, which is within the Mexican cartels, in which we've already discussed that the cartels have sort of a stranglehold upon the Mexican government through fear. And there's been some moves to help kind of alleviate that process, but it's a bit of an epidemic still. And then the president isn't really doing much. Arguably, she's even protecting the cartels. So we can go back to cartels, terrorist. Apparently, there's not 3 R's. Okay. All right. So we'll read this article. So Donald Trump has signed off on a new U.S. counterterrorism strategy that sets eliminating drug cartels into the Western Hemisphere. The document was released months after the administration updated its national security strategy that called for the hemisphere to be the top U.S. focus. We will not let the cartels, the jihadists, the government support a plot against our citizens, and terrorists of any kind will not be allowed to find safe harbor here, at home, or attack. So let's see. This is the latest example that demonstrates it remains committed to sharpening U.S. foreign policy on or... Sorry, I just screwed that up. I think I just hit something. Okay. Sorry, I hit the camera, so I apologize. All right. So let's scroll up here. Okay. So if we were to talk about this in particular, okay. So let's go back up to here. So some of the issues with becoming... All right, gonna move over some. All right. So All right, so here it is. So another major national security issue developing right now is the growing shift towards treating Mexican cartels as more than just traditional criminal organizations. Because cartels are using explosive drones and increasingly sophisticated tactics, entire communities are in part of Mexico are being displaced by cartel violence, expanded U.S. counterterrorism focus on the Western Hemisphere threats. So all this matters, right? So there's an ongoing debate on whether the cartel should be viewed as criminal enterprises. Whether they're insurgent style groups, terrorist networks, or some hybrid from all three. Because this matters because this classification changes the entire framework of how governments respond. If viewed primarily as criminal organizations, law enforcement remain in the lead. They will focus the stay on arrests, interdiction investigations that will all be local law enforcement. And even the prosecution will stay within those particular avenues. If they are viewed through a counterterrorism or an insurgency lens, the intelligence collection will expand. Certain intelligence agencies will now have permissions to get involved that were not allowed to prior. For example, think of like the intelligence agencies that prior, if they're just a criminal organization, is just essentially local law enforcement and the FBI. But then if they're determined counterterrorism insurgency, organizations like the CIA, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA can start to get involved. The financial warfare will intensify because once it's their terrorist organization, the funding in order to combat them also increases. Cross-border operational questions then emerge because a lot of organizations who then do stuff with counterterrorism, they are not allowed to operate domestically. For example, the CIA is not allowed to, essentially the CIA and the NSA are not allowed to operate domestically. They can only operate outside of the borders. So they would then have to sort of create these hybrid teams where they would fight these counterterrorism forces, like, for example, dealing with Mexican cartels, but they'd also have to be there because the second they cross the border, the CIA and the NSA would either have to have some sort of deal where it's like hands off, or they have to be in the presence of FBI agents. There are a number of different deals that can be done. I'm sure people have seen the movie Sicario. Stuff is kind of like that. Not exactly, but it can be. There are ways to work around these particular authorities and situations. I've definitely been involved in that, where you find a way to get around authorities. But that would definitely something that would be established, need to be done, is worked as far as TTPs and how they particularly do that. And it's different in every particular situation. All right. And then also, by labeling it a terrorist organization, you now have national security authorities, and then military capabilities can now become more involved. Essentially, where there was always the discussion of whether or not Delta Force gets involved, and these others like high level tier 1 and all the different levels of special operations organizations, which some of them have been very successful in the past. Everybody knows that tier 1, like one of the first successful operations of ISA was actually helping to kill, was instrumental in killing Pablo Escobar. So this is not something that we're new. We've definitely been dealing with drugs throughout. The military has been dealing with drugs throughout, majority of the special operations career. So we definitely have experience in it. The question is, how much focus does we want to put into this? And because the cartels are not like, they're their own paramilitary organizations, right? They essentially would be playing defense. We would have to be going onto their turf. And we would like to think that these type of organizations would be like how Maduro was, right? Unfortunately, that's not going to be how the case. We might have some successful operations, but people are going to die if we decide to throw the military at this particular situation. Is it probably one of the better ways, the quickest ways to attempt to solve this issue? Possibly, but you also have to think about the terrorist, and like the cartels would be very equivalent to um, insurgent organizations in the Middle East, right? You might be able to kill one or kill a couple, but how many are going to replace the ones that you kill, right? There is an argument that the cartels are not, it's not a theological or necessarily an ideological organizations. It's criminal. It's based off of money, and that, there are less sort of motivations for them to continue fighting once you've done a certain amount of damage to them. But that's more of a theory. These people, this is definitely their way of life, and a lot of them, life is definitely kind of cheap in that particular, not only organization, but that part of the world. And these people would be definitely willing to not only kill, they're definitely willing to kill, but also willing to die for these particular situations. So sending the military will definitely make progress, but there's going to be losses on both sides of this. All right. So the other things to talk about in this particular is one of the biggest realities that people often look is that in many modern cartel organizations, they already operate with capabilities that resemble probably hybrid warfare networks. So they already have a lot of cartels. They have their own intelligence organizations. They have intelligence like officers, commanders. They have their own media and propaganda, and they do their own intimidation media campaigns. They have their own territorial control. They have they're kind of like almost like little countries, operate, and definitely how their organizational structure is. They're definitely becoming closer to very military and very professional organizations, not just like the random gangbang networks that you think that some of these are. These terrorist cartels are extremely professional organizations, and they are not held by the laws and restrictions and morals of other governments, especially the United States government. They operate through corruption and political influence. So when dealing with them, and you're dealing with the Mexican government and how you were going to combat them, the same thing, we had the same problems in Iraq, is that if you were to go essentially put a warrant in for a particular target, if you put that warrant within that target's tribal network, it was very, very common for that target to be warned through his tribe that one second. All right. One second. All right. Sorry, I'm back. My phone started going off. All right. What was I saying? Let's see. All right. So another issues is, anyways, just going back to the cartel's capabilities. These guys are doing drone reconnaissance. They're doing drone attacks. They have cross-border logistic pipelines like international, and they definitely have grown to having some really strong sort of some paramilitaries. Like they definitely are growing their own military, or especially their paramilitary capabilities. And to really think about this, right? So the explosive drone issue is particularly important because it kind of reflects how technologies once associated with mostly overseas battlefields are now coming into these battlefields of dealing with the cartels. So the same way that we deal with sort of like our modern battlefields is kind of similar to how we're going to have to deal with the cartels, because they are incorporating a lot of the same tactics, equipment, and techniques that other countries like Iran have. So that needs to be taken into a question. And they're also under the hardest part is they are operating under the sort of protection of the political government and officials within Mexico, which definitely makes things harder. So like going back to the comment about, having to, if we were going to go after a target in Iraq, and I put in a warrant to go get him and had to go through an Iraqi judge, and if I did not go to a regional judge, and it went into the same tribe, to a judge in the same tribe as our target, he would probably find out. So, we would have to do the same things, where what we ended up doing was we ended up going to regional judges, where we would submit these judges within the political system or the judicial system that was outside of that tribal system, right? So you would have to do something similar, right? I understand it's not tribal, but you would have to find the politicians that you could work with who are not yet compromised by the particular cartels, it's a very complicated issue, because it's actually even harder to dictate where those lines are when it's not based off of tribe and religion, when it's based off of money, because at any one point, one of these politicians could be turned. Let's just say they're not working for the cartels when you first start working them, but they could be eventually turned. And so you have to constantly update and constantly be criticizing your sources within the own political government in the environment that you're operating. So it complicates things drastically. All right, so let's answer some questions. Thoughts on Ukraine doing operation with only robots and drones? Are soldiers going to be useless soon? No, soldiers are never really going to be useless, at least not in the foreseeable future. It definitely changes warfare, right? And to be honest, we sort of actually predicted this like 15 years ago. I was sitting actually down at Delta, and we were doing planning for theory crafting, essentially, for what we thought future warfare was going to look like. And we basically predicted that it was basically just going to be like special forces, special operations on special operations, and we would just be killing each other with drones. That's what we predicted back in like 2012, 2013, which is not really that far off to what we ended up seeing in Ukraine. So it's like with anything, we have to adjust. Warfare is a constant adaptation to the capabilities on both sides. And so humans are not going to become useless, because humans, at least not in the foreseeable future, just because there's that decision matrix that needs to be, that AI and robots are not at the level that they can do that. But it does definitely change of how we fight these wars and how we fight these conflicts currently. And that's going to constantly change, because how it's obviously very different than how we fought 20 years ago. But even 20 years ago is completely different than how we fought conflicts 30 years prior. And that can go back over and over again. Well, I never knew cartels ran Mexican government. Yes, that's one of the reasons why the cartels are such a big problem. The problem is the local legal and cultural system. Absolutely. Bernard, it's actually, I would say it's both, right? So it comes from, so us defining them as a terrorist organization, it honestly just ups the game to where we have more capabilities. Leaving it just at the criminal level, especially when the main problem, as you pointed out, is the cartels. The biggest problem with the cartels right now is the fact that they are so embedded within the Mexican government, and they have so many officials within their pocket that probably is even more justification, in my personal opinion, that they need to be upgraded to essentially a terrorist organization. So with that, organizations like the military, the CIA, the NSA can then sort of become involved. But that, like I said, that brings its own risks, that puts more of the Americans at risk. But then the conversation then is like, okay, do we risk more American lives to how many more that we save? And that is like the kind of like that time tested question is, you know, how many people is it going to take to save a certain number of people? You know, how do you quantify that? How do you even qualify that? And so these are all really good questions to ask. And I don't think that there's any specific right answer. But as far as escalation, that is probably, if you were going to combat this, if you wanted to escalate the situation where we actually try to do something about it, I believe it would require for us to make them a terrorist organization. So more government and intelligence and military assets would become available at the disposal to sort of attack this problem. Even if they're arrested, they will continue to act because the system is corrupt. Absolutely. And that's also a really good point. So we've actually looked at case studies about this over the years in almost every. So if you go to Africa, right? And I spent a lot of my career in Africa, one of the things that we noticed that anytime that there was a nation like that was dealing with corruption and sort of was like a failing state, whether it's the Congo or any of these other nations, there was essentially, we found that there were three things that were sort of like pillars that were either they were failing in one or multiples of these different areas, which is one was security, because in Africa, you got to remember the main problem is not necessarily as like drugs, but over there it's food, right? So you get these warlords who control the income of the food, and you know there's plenty of food to go around, but the problem is these warlords in these particular African countries take control of the food. So if you don't have security, you can't stop the warlords from taking the food, right? And then you have the judicial system, right? So if you have a corrupt judicial system, even if you have a security system that arrests these guys, if the judicial system is not working, then there's nobody to, you know, there's no point, because then they're not going to be sent to jail. And then the third part is the penitentiary system, right? Because let's just say that you do have a working security system and you do have a working judicial system, but if then you don't have anywhere to put these criminals, they're just going to go back out into the greater public and just going to recycle this process. And almost in every country that we did case studies on in Africa, that all the ones that were failing to essentially control the warlords were missing either two out of these three pillars, which is security, judicial, and essentially the penitentiary system. So you could actually draw the same conclusions looking towards Mexico of why the reasons why Mexico is having such issues is because they're the judicial, and El Salvador had the same problem. But El Salvador fixed this problem by one of the things, as Brunel pointed out, is they obviously they kind of purged the government of like all the corrupt, but they created this like super max prison and then just sent anybody who had any sort of criminal record associated with the gangs down there. And I think they went from being, correct me if I'm wrong, like one of the highest murder rates in the world to like one of now the lowest. Or maybe it wasn't necessarily the murder rates, but they were definitely one of the most dangerous countries to visit in the world. And now they're one of the safest. And one of the things is they took care of one of the most important pillars of that, which is the judicial, the penitentiary. So they sealed up those three pillars, which is security, judicial, penitentiary. Probably is a better word to use for that. The penal system. And now that is called, but Mexico needs to do something very similar. It's one, Mexico is a much bigger country, but they have this very similar problems. So Mexico needs to fix I think it really comes down to it's their governmental, judicial, and their penitentiary system. And security we can definitely help with. The other two are definitely Mexico's problem. And if they really want to fix it, they need to fix that. They need to establish that. We can help them with the security part, but they need to be able to prosecute the people we do capture, and then they need to put them in jail and need to keep them in jail. And that way they don't get out. And then we just have to keep picking them up time and time again. They're also involved in politics. Even if they are classified as terrorists, how would you act if you were someone ranking high politics? Yeah, exactly like what I was saying. By the way, Brown, you're asking some pretty good questions. I appreciate that. Yeah, it complicates things because you have to, like, this is where you're gonna have to do. We'll have to do intelligence operations, and this is how we do things, anyways. But it just makes it that much harder and much longer of a vetting process of vetting the intelligence coming. You have to vet the sources, and then especially in a landscape like Mexico, because at any one time, a source who is credible prior could have been turned in the meantime. So you have to constantly vet them. And because a source was good at one point, I guarantee you the operating sort of TTPs of dealing with sources, we're going to have to vet every piece of intel that comes out of them, even if they have a good track record, which is going to slow the process down, make things even more difficult. Like Mexico will not be an easy set of operations, if you will. Way Calvin compliant, way too much catch and release here in the U.S. as we think, so little judges. Yeah, and that's true. And Mexico has it even worse. And then, like I said, these case studies of these African countries, they were definitely one of the biggest issues. So we have to shore up. You have to capture the criminals. You have to prosecute them. And then once you do that, then you have to put them in jail. And then if there's a hole anywhere in that 3-step process, it just constantly recycle, and you're never going to fix the problem. We see this all over the world. We see it in Mexico. We see it in our own country. I think luckily in the United States, I think we're starting to get a bit of a handle on it, which is good. Obviously, we have a long way to go, but Mexico is one of the biggest problems. And that is one of the biggest issues of us doing aid to try to fight the cartels is what's the point if the Mexican system is just, we're basically going to have to just keep going after the same guys and be this endless conflict. That's just never going to stop. Almost could be a very similar to Iraq and Afghanistan kind of situation if we're not careful. Hopefully, and that always comes back to us, we need to learn from our mistakes. Have the humility to, like, America's not perfect, right? I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. The United States is not perfect. We just be able to admit that, right? But once you're able to admit that, you can understand what the mistakes you made. Okay, cool. We made mistakes, right? We're human. How do you learn from them? And that's the most important part. And then what are you going to take? Are you going to take actions from the lessons learned, implement them, and go forward? If you do that, we can find success continuously later in life. And that really comes down to, you can draw parallels to the fall of the Roman Empire. We are in a unique position where we have access to all of history, all the information. We can learn from our mistakes. We can learn from the mistakes of Rome and other past empires, other past nations, other past powers. And we can at least delay as much as possible and extend the life of this nation and also improve upon it if we're able to have the humility, admit our own mistakes, learn from them, and implement processes that make things better. And we learn and we move on from there. And that's honestly, I feel like that's the only way to do this type of things. So, Silver Soldier 14, how do you feel about the alien files, also missing scientists, also going to the moon for no reason recently? That is a really good question. Silver Soldier 14, and I'm gonna be honest, so that is something we're going to talk about on Friday. So I have good news. I just hired an editing company, and we are going to, you're about to see an increase in my frequency of my videos. You're going to see an increase in the quality of my videos, and we're now going to do 2 lives a week. We're going to do every Monday and Friday at 1 p.m. And so this Friday, we're actually saving the subject about the aliens for the subject for Friday. And obviously we'll be talking about more things on Friday as well. So we're going to call the stream here. I want you guys to appreciate everybody. We're going to be working on, so this is my first day working with the editing company. You're going to see a lot of changes over the next couple of weeks, so just everybody bear with me. But luckily, like I said, the frequency is going to improve. The quality of the posts are going to improve, and we should just start to honestly see a whole lot better product and a lot more content coming out, and a lot better content. So I appreciate everybody. I hope you guys have a good evening, and I will definitely talk to you guys on Friday. Talk to you guys later.